Hey guys, welcome back, weary traveler, to another journey into the quiet corners of the past. It's a pleasure to have you here, settling in as the world outside grows still. Before we begin our tale, I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? What does the sky look like beyond your window? Do share in the comments below. It's always a quiet joy to know where these stories land. Tonight, we venture north to a world of icy fjords, dragon-proud longships, and smoldering hearths. We are not here to witness the fury of the berserker or the thrill of a raid, but something far more intimate and chilling, the world of Viking law. It was a world where your honor was your life, where justice was decided not by kings, but by free men under an open sky, and where the price for stepping out of line was often a fate far colder and more permanent than any winter frost. If this kind of storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. For now, get comfortable. Let the world settle around you, and allow the gentle cadence of history to be your guide. Dim the lights, and let us step back in time. Before we delve into the grim specifics of crime and consequence, let us first set the stage. To understand Viking justice, you must first understand the Viking world. And it was a world far removed from the grand stone cities of Rome or Constantinople. Picture, if you will, a land carved by ancient ice and fierce winds. A world of deep, silent fjords, where the water is as cold as liquid steel, and mountains draped in mist loom like sleeping giants. The air here is sharp, clean, and carries the scent of pine and salt. This is Scandinavia in the 9th century. Life for most Norsemen was not a constant adventure of raiding and exploration. It was a quiet, demanding existence tied to the earth. Small, self-sufficient farmsteads dotted the landscape, each a little kingdom of its own, with wooden longhouses built from heavy timber, their roofs covered in turf that grew green in the short, bright summer. Here, families lived and worked, their lives governed by the turning of the seasons. They tilled the rocky soil, herded sheep and cattle, and fished in the cold, clear waters. Survival was a daily negotiation with a harsh environment. The winters were long, dark, and isolating, a time for mending tools, weaving cloth, and telling stories around a central hearth fire that seemed to be the only thing holding back the endless night. In this world, your community was everything. You relied on your neighbors not just for trade, but for survival. A failed harvest could mean starvation, and a lone family was vulnerable to the elements and to those with ill intent. Because of this, the bonds of kinship and friendship were forged in iron. You were known not just as an individual, but as the son or daughter of your father, a member of your clan. And the single most valuable thing you owned, more precious than a sword, a ship, or a silver arm ring, was your reputation. In the Norse world, honor was not a vague, philosophical concept. It was a tangible asset, the currency of your social existence. It determined who would marry you, who would trade with you, and who would stand with you in a fight. Your domer, your name, and the judgment of your character was the legacy you would leave behind, whispered in stories long after your body had returned to the earth. To lose your honor was to become a ghost while still living, a person without a place in the social fabric. It is this profound obsession with honor and reputation that explains why a simple insult could be a capital offense, and why public shame was often a punishment more feared than death itself. For the Vikings, A wound to the body could heal, but a wound to one's name could fester for generations. So where did one go when honor was slighted, a cow was stolen, or a kinsman was killed? There were no grand courthouses with marble columns, no bewigged judges sitting on high benches. Justice was simpler, more direct, and held in the open air. It was found at the Thing. The Thing was the local, and later regional, assembly of the free people of the land. Several times a year, farmers, chieftains, and warriors would put down their tools and their swords and gather at a designated, sacred spot, perhaps a large field, a clearing in the woods, or a place marked by ancient stones. Here, under the vast, often gray sky, they would make laws, air grievances, and pass judgment. It was the heart of Norse democracy and the center of their legal world. Presiding over the assembly was a figure known as the law speaker. This was not a judge in the modern sense, but a living library of legal tradition. It was his duty to memorize the law of the land in its entirety and recite 1/3 of it at each annual assembly, ensuring the old ways were never forgotten. When a case was brought forth, he would advise on the correct legal procedure, but the judgment itself was rendered by a panel of a dozen or more local chieftains or respected landowners. What is most striking about this system is its lack of central authority. There was no king who decreed the law, and no police force to carry out a sentence. The laws of the Thing were born from consensus, an agreement among equals on how they would live together. And once a verdict was reached, a fine to be paid, a man to be banished, it was up to the wronged party and their family to enforce it. The Thing gave you the legal right to seek compensation or retribution. It did not do the work for you. This created a system that was intensely personal. Justice wasn't an abstract concept delivered by the state. It was a right you had to be strong enough, respected enough, and determined enough to claim for yourself. It was in this arena of honor, community, and self-reliance that the fate of a Viking criminal was decided. And, as we shall see, the consequences for breaking the fragile trust of this world were as creative as they were brutal. In this world of hard-won survival, the fabric of society was held together by a simple, unwritten rule: you do not take what is not yours. While the sagas sing of bloody feuds and epic battles, the most common crime that troubled the lives of ordinary Norsemen was far more mundane, yet just as serious. It was theft. To us, theft might conjure images of pickpockets in a crowded market or burglars in the night. To a Viking farmer, theft was an existential threat. It was an act that could unravel the delicate balance of a household's survival. Imagine, for a moment, you are a farmer in 10th century Norway. Your life is measured in seasons and the health of your small herd. You own 2 cows. They are not mere animals. They are your family's lifeline. They provide milk for your children, cheese and butter to last through the long, dark winter, and calves that represent your future wealth. One morning, you awaken to a chilling silence. You step out of the longhouse into the crisp air, and you see it. The gate to their pasture is broken, and one of the cows is gone. The feeling that washes over you is not just anger, but cold, creeping fear. The thief who acted in the night did not just steal a cow. They stole months of food. They stole your children's security. They stole the fragile peace of your homestead. This is why theft, or þjófnaður, was considered such a profoundly dishonorable crime. It was not the act of a warrior who took from his enemies openly in a raid, an act that could bring fame and glory. Theft was the work of a coward, a nidingur, who skulked in the shadows and took from his own neighbors. It was an act of secrecy and shame, and the law reflected this contempt. If a thief was caught, their journey through the Norse legal system would begin. For a first offense, the punishment was typically restorative, not purely punitive. The goal was to make the victim whole again and shame the offender into rejoining the social order. The thief would be brought before the thing, the assembly of their peers, where the evidence would be presented. If found guilty, they were often required to pay back the value of the stolen goods, but not just the simple value. The law frequently demanded a threefold restitution. You stole 1 cow, you now owed the farmer 3 cows, or their equivalent in silver. This was a crushing financial blow, one designed to be a powerful deterrent. But the punishment was not only financial, it was also public. The entire community would know of your crime. Your name would be stained. You would be watched, distrusted. Your honor, that invisible but essential shield, was now dented, perhaps permanently. This public humiliation was as much a part of the sentence as the fine itself. In some cases, lesser physical punishments might accompany the fine, a whipping, or being placed in stocks for a time, ensuring the thief's shame was visible to all. The law, however, had little patience for repeat offenders. If you were caught stealing a second time, the penalties escalated dramatically. The fines would be higher, the public shaming more severe. You might be subjected to lesser outlawry, forced to leave your home and community for a period of 3 years, your property confiscated to pay your debts. You were cast out, a wanderer, with a tainted name. And if you were foolish or desperate enough to be convicted of theft a third time, the community's patience would be at an end that the person who repeatedly violated the trust of their neighbors was no longer seen as a redeemable member of society. They were a festering wound that needed to be cut out. For the habitual thief, the final punishment was often full outlawry, a living death or execution. You had proven you could not live within the bounds of honor, so you would not be allowed to live at all. In the Viking world, the price of a stolen cow was far more than just its weight in silver. It could cost you your home, your name, and ultimately, your life. While the theft of a cow could ruin a farmer's livelihood, there was another crime in the Viking world that could destroy something even more valuable, a person's very identity. This was the crime of slander. A concept the Norse took so seriously, it was governed by a complex set of rules and carried the gravest of consequences. In our modern world, we are accustomed to a constant barrage of words, casual insults, online arguments, fleeting remarks. But for a Viking, a word, once spoken, had weight. It had power, and a carefully crafted insult was not just an offense. It was a weapon, capable of killing a reputation as surely as a sword could kill a man. This type of slander was known as nith. It was not simple name-calling. A nith was a formal, public accusation that attacked the core of a person's honor. The most potent and dangerous forms of nith were aimed at a man's masculinity and courage. To call a man a coward was a grave insult. But to accuse him of urgy, a complex term implying unmanliness, effeminacy, and, specifically, being the passive partner in a sexual relationship with another man was the most destructive accusation imaginable. In a society where a man's worth was tied to his strength, bravery, and ability to lead and protect his family, such an accusation was a form of social annihilation. These insults were not merely shouted in the heat of an argument. They were often delivered with a chilling artistry. A talented poet, a skald, could weave a myth into a verse of mocking poetry, performing it at a feast for all to hear. The clever rhymes and sharp wit would ensure the insult was memorable, repeated, and spread from farm to farm, forever clinging to the victim's name. An even more menacing form was the nidstong, or spite pole. A person seeking to curse or shame an enemy might carve a horse's head, place it atop a tall pole, and point it in the direction of their foe's home, often with runes carved into the wood that detailed the insult. This was not just a prank. It was a powerful act of ritual magic and public condemnation, a declaration of hate that the entire landscape could witness. So what could a man do if his honor was attacked in such a way? The law was surprisingly and terrifyingly clear. A man who was the subject of a major nith, particularly an accusation of ergiai, had the legal right to kill the slanderer on the spot. The law recognized that the verbal assault was so damaging that immediate, violent retribution was justified. The man who drew his sword and struck down his accuser would not be charged with murder. He was simply defending his honor, the very foundation of his existence. Imagine the tension in a crowded longhouse when a skald finishes a mocking poem. All eyes turn to the man who has been shamed. In that moment, he has a choice. He can allow the words to stand, and with them, suffer a social death, his name forever poisoned. Or he can stand, draw his weapon, and answer the insult with steel, restoring his honor in blood, all with the full blessing of the law. Of course, immediate violence was not the only option. The wronged party could also choose a more civic path and summon the slanderer to the thing. There. If the accusation was proven to be false and malicious, the punishment for the offender was severe. They could face hefty fines or even be declared a lesser outlaw, forced into exile for their wicked words. The law understood that words had the power to destabilize the community, to incite feuds, and to shatter the peace. It therefore provided an outlet, a way to channel the rage that such an insult would inevitably provoke. In the world of the Vikings, the old saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," would have been met with grim laughter. They knew better. They knew that a bone could mend, but a reputation, once broken, might be lost forever. And they had laws as sharp as any blade to prove it. In a society armed with axes, swords, and a fierce sense of honor, violence was an undeniable part of life. Disputes could flare up at a feast, on a farmstead, or at the thing itself. But the Norsemen, for all their warrior ethos, drew a profound legal and moral line when it came to the act of killing. To them, not all bloodshed was the same. The law made a sharp distinction between a killing done openly and one done in the shadows. This was the difference between manslaughter and murder. And it was a distinction that could mean the difference between paying a fine and suffering a living death. Manslaughter, known in Old Norse as vig, was a killing committed in public view. It might happen during a heated argument that escalates into a fight in a duel, or as an act of immediate revenge for a grave insult. The crucial element was its openness. The killer did not flee the scene or hide their actions. In fact, the law demanded the opposite. To avoid being branded a murderer, a person who had just killed someone was legally obligated to announce the deed, a practice known as vigleasing. They had to go to the nearest farm or group of people and declare, "I have killed this man," stating their own name and the name of the victim. This act of taking responsibility, of facing the consequences of your actions, head-on was a matter of honor. It transformed a potential crime of cowardice into a legal matter that could be settled. Murder, or mord, was another matter entirely. This was a killing done with stealth and secrecy, an ambush in the dark of night, poison in a drink, or slaying a man while he slept. These were the acts of a murderer. Hiding the body or concealing one's identity after a killing also turned the act into mord. This was not the work of a warrior, but of an assassin, a coward who lacked the courage to face their enemy openly. In the eyes of the community, murder was one of the most despicable and dishonorable crimes a person could commit. It was a tear in the fabric of society, an act of treachery that inspired not grudging respect, but utter contempt. The legal consequences for these two acts could not have been more different. For an act of manslaughter, the primary path to resolution was through the payment of compensation, a system known as wergild, which literally translates to man price. This was a sum of money or goods paid by the killer and their family to the family of the deceased. It was not a punishment in the modern sense, but a form of restorative justice, designed to prevent a cycle of revenge killings and to formally settle the feud. If the wergild was offered and accepted, the matter was legally closed. The value of the wergild was not arbitrary. It was meticulously calculated based on the social standing of the person who had been killed. Every free individual had a price. A powerful chieftain, a jarl, was worth a fortune in silver and livestock. A typical free farmer, a carl, was worth a considerable but more manageable sum. A freed slave, a lacing, had a much lower price. And a slave, a thrall, had no wergild at all. Their death was simply a property loss for their owner, who would be compensated for the economic damage. This system, while appearing cold to us, reinforced the social hierarchy and provided a clear, if unequal, path to reconciliation. But for the murderer, there was no wergild to be paid. A secret killing could not be compensated with silver because it was an act devoid of honor. A person convicted of mord at the thing was typically sentenced to the harshest punishment of all full outlawry. They were declared a skogarmadur, a man of the forest, stripped of all property, all rights, and all human connection. They were to be shunned by all, and anyone could kill them without fear of reprisal. To kill openly was a crime that could be settled. To kill in secret was to forfeit your own right to exist within the circle of humanity. How, then, was justice truly decided in a world without police, prisons, or professional lawyers? It was not done behind closed doors or through quiet paperwork. It was a public and often dramatic ritual that unfolded at the thing, the open-air assembly that was the pulsing heart of Norse society. To bring a case to the thing was to step out of the shadows of a private grievance and into the light of public judgment, where the entire community became both witness and jury. The process began not at the assembly itself, but at the home of the accused. The plaintiff, the one who had been wronged, could not simply show up at the thing and point a finger. They had to follow a strict and sacred procedure. Along with a number of witnesses, they would travel to the defendant's farmstead to issue a formal summons. This was a critical step. In front of the defendant's own household, the plaintiff would publicly declare the charge and state that they were summoning the accused to answer for it at the next thing. This act ensured that the accusation was not a mere rumor. It was a formal challenge, delivered openly and honorably. A mistake in the wording or the ritual of the summons could jeopardize the entire case later on. With the summons delivered, both the plaintiff and the defendant would spend the coming weeks preparing. This was not a matter of gathering physical evidence in the modern sense. Instead, it was a campaign to gather human support. Each side needed to find oath helpers, respected members of the community willing to come to the thing and swear to the good character of the person they supported. The more oath helpers you had, and the higher their social standing, the stronger your case would be. Securing the support of a powerful local chieftain was a monumental advantage, as his word and his backing carried immense weight. This period was a flurry of negotiation, persuasion, and the calling in of old favors. Your reputation in the community was now your most critical line of defense. When the day of the thing finally arrived, it was far more than just a legal gathering. It was one of the most important social events of the year. Families would travel for days, setting up tent-like booths or boudis around the assembly field. The air would be thick with the smoke of cooking fires and the buzz of conversation. It was a place for trade, for arranging marriages, for sharing news, and for political maneuvering. But at its core, it was a place of law. When a case was called, the proceedings would unfold in a designated area, often a circle of stones known as the domringer, or judgment ring. The plaintiff would step forward and state their case, following a precise verbal formula. The defendant would then offer their response, also adhering to strict procedural rules. The evidence presented was not forensic, but social. Witnesses were called not to describe what they saw, but to swear oaths upon a sacred object, often a silver arm ring consecrated to a god. To swear a false oath was a horrific sin, an act that invited the wrath of the gods not just upon yourself, but upon your entire family vow. It was this deep-seated fear of divine retribution that gave the oath its power. The law speaker would hover over the proceedings, a human anchor to tradition, ensuring every step was performed correctly. He did not pass judgment, but he was the ultimate authority on procedure. After all the oaths were sworn and the cases stated, a panel of judges, or domir, would deliberate. Their role was to weigh the strength of the oaths and the reputation of those involved before delivering a verdict. The judgment would declare one party to be in the right and would name the penalty, typically a fine. But this verdict was not an end. It was a beginning. It was a legal license, granting the winning party the right to claim what was theirs. The thing had spoken. But the final act of justice was still a private matter, a duty that now had to be carried out by the victor. While the specter of outlawry and the sharp edge of the axe loomed over the gravest of crimes, the everyday reality of Viking justice was far less bloody. It was, in fact, remarkably pragmatic. For the vast majority of offenses, from petty theft to accidental injury and even manslaughter, the path to resolution was not paved with violence, but with silver and goods. The Norse legal system was built upon a sophisticated and deeply ingrained principle of compensation. The primary goal was not to punish the offender in a cell, but to restore the balance that their crime had upset, and to mend the tear in the community's fabric. This system made perfect sense in a society without a centralized state or prisons. Locking a person away would deprive their family of a worker and serve no practical benefit to the victim. An execution, while final, would almost certainly trigger a blood feud, a destructive cycle of revenge that could poison a community for generations. Fines, on the other hand, offered a solution that was both elegant and effective. They forced the wrongdoer to acknowledge their crime through a tangible loss. They directly compensated the victim for their suffering or material damage. And most crucially, they provided a formal, public end to the dispute. Once the price was paid, honor was considered restored. The currency of this justice was varied. While silver, often in the form of arm rings or chopped up pieces known as hack silver, valued by weight, was the standard. Fines could also be paid in kind. A farmer might pay his debt with cattle, sheep, bolts of woven wool cloth known as vadmal, or even land. This flexibility ensured that justice could be served even in remote areas where minted currency was rare. The law codes, such as the famous Icelandic Gragas Grey Goose laws, contained astonishingly detailed lists of fines for nearly every imaginable offense. There was a specific price for the loss of a front tooth, another for a broken arm, another for an insult delivered at a feast. The law attempted to quantify every harm, from the physical to the emotional, and assign it a value. This was not a simple, one-size-fits-all system. The amount of the fine, the bog, was intricately tied to the social hierarchy. The wergild, or man price, paid for a killing was the most extreme example, but the principle applied to lesser crimes as well. A wound inflicted upon a chieftain would cost the perpetrator far more than the exact same wound inflicted upon a common farmer. This was because the fine compensated not only for the physical injury, but also for the injury to the person's honor and standing in the community. An offense against a powerful man was an offense against the stability he represented, and the price reflected that. Furthermore, the payment of a fine was often a collective, family affair. If a man was unable to pay the full amount himself, his immediate and extended family were expected to contribute. This shared responsibility reinforced the powerful bonds of kinship and impressed upon everyone that the actions of an individual had consequences for the entire clan. Likewise, the compensation was paid not just to the direct victim, but was shared among their family members. Justice was a transaction between families, a way of formally acknowledging a wrong and collectively agreeing to move past it. It was a system designed not for abstract retribution, but for the practical and vital purpose of maintaining peace in a dangerous world. When words failed and compensation was refused, when a dispute was so deeply tied to honor that only a test of arms could resolve it, Viking law provided one final, fearsome option. This was the holmgang, the ritual duel. It was not a chaotic street brawl or a desperate fight for survival. It was a formal, legally recognized procedure, a trial by combat where the gods themselves were believed to render the ultimate verdict. To challenge a man to a holmgang was to state that your claim was so just, you were willing to stake your life on it. The name holmgang literally means to go to a small island, or islet walk, which hints at its origins. Duels were often held on a small, remote holm to ensure a fair fight with no chance of interference or escape. Later, the fighting area was more commonly marked out on land, often on a cloak or animal hide staked to the ground in a square. The rules, while varying by region and time, were remarkably specific. Each combatant was typically allowed a certain number of shields, often 3. If one shield was broken, it would be cast aside and another used. The duelists would take turns striking, and there were rules about how one could move. To step outside the marked area with both feet was a sign of cowardice, an automatic forfeit. The duel would end when one man was wounded. Often the rule was first blood disarmed or killed. In some cases, a duelist could buy themselves off the home by paying a pre-agreed ransom if they were losing badly. The outcome of the duel settled the legal dispute permanently. If two men fought over a piece of land, the victor won the land. If it was a matter of debt, the loser's side had to pay. The winner was declared right in the eyes of the law and the gods. A challenge to a holmgang was a heavy thing. It was a public declaration that could not be easily ignored. To refuse a challenge was an act of profound dishonor. The man who backed down would be branded a nidingur, a coward and a man of no worth. This social stigma was so powerful that most men would rather risk death in the duel than live with the shame of refusal. This, however, created a dark side to the practice. Over time, the holmgang began to be abused. Skilled and ruthless warriors, particularly the feared berserkers, realized they could use the duel as a form of legal extortion. A powerful fighter could challenge a less experienced landowner for his farm, his wife, or his possessions. The landowner faced an impossible choice: accept the duel and face certain death or injury, or refuse and forfeit his property while being publicly shamed. The holmgang had devolved from a tool of justice into a weapon for bullies. It was this corruption of the custom that ultimately led to its demise. As Viking societies grew more stable and organized, and especially after the conversion to Christianity, this form of state-sanctioned violence was increasingly seen as barbaric and unjust. The idea that might makes right, blessed by the old gods, no longer sat well in a world with more centralized laws and a new morality. Iceland, a land governed entirely by law without a king, was one of the first to act, outlawing the holmgang in the year 1006. Norway and other Scandinavian regions soon followed. The age of settling disputes with a formal challenge and a swing of the sword was coming to a close. But for centuries, it had remained the final arbiter of truth, a terrifying and sacred ritual where a man's honor was laid bare upon a field of combat, and justice was measured in blood and steel. For crimes too grave to be settled with silver, yet not so dishonorable as to warrant immediate death, the Norse world devised a punishment that struck at the very heart of a Viking's identity: banishment. To be cast out from the community, to be severed from the kin who gave you your name and the land that gave you your sustenance, was a truly terrifying prospect. But just as with killing, the law recognized different degrees of this social death. The first, and less severe, was a sentence of lesser outlawry, known as Fjorbaugssgarder. This was, in essence, a temporary exile. A person sentenced to lesser outlawry at the Thing, perhaps for a serious theft or a killing where the wergild could not be fully paid, was given a grace period, often a few weeks, to settle their affairs and leave the country. They were banished for a term of 3 years. During that time, they were forbidden from setting foot on their native soil. If they were found, they could be killed without penalty. A portion of their property was confiscated to pay fines and compensate their victims, but their core inheritance and some assets were often held in trust. Their family was not destroyed, and their name was not entirely erased. They were still, in the eyes of the law, a person, albeit one whose rights were suspended. They were expected to travel abroad, perhaps hiring themselves out as a mercenary or finding work in a foreign port. It was a period of trial and wandering, a forced journey into the unknown. The key to lesser outlawry was the promise of return. If the outlaw survived their 3 years of exile and managed to make their way back home, they could through a formal process, be reinstated into society. Their rights would be restored, their remaining property returned. The slate was, in a legal sense, wiped clean. It was a second chance. It acknowledged that a person could make a grave mistake, pay a heavy price for it, and eventually be welcomed back into the warmth of the community. It was a harsh and lonely path, but it was not a hopeless one. It was a journey to the edge of the world, but not beyond it. Beyond the slim hope of lesser outlawry lay a far deeper and more permanent darkness. This was the sentence of full outlawry, or skaganger. This was not a temporary exile. It was a complete and total erasure of a person's existence. To be declared a full outlaw was to be pronounced legally dead. This fate was reserved for the worst offenders, convicted murderers who had killed in secret, those who had sworn false oaths before the gods, traitors who had betrayed their chieftain, or those sentenced to lesser outlawry who defiantly refused to leave. When the thing passed a sentence of full outlawry, the person ceased to be. Their property was confiscated in its entirety. Their marriage was declared void, their wife now a widow. Their children were considered orphans. They were no longer a member of their family, their community, or the human race. They had become a skogar mader, a forest man, a wolf in holy places. The skogar mader was a hunted creature. He had no rights, no protection, and no name. Anyone, at any time, could kill him without facing any legal consequence. In fact, killing a full outlaw was often seen as a commendable act, a civic duty to cleanse the land of a corrupting presence. The outlaw could not be given food, shelter, or any form of aid. To help a forest man was to commit a crime so serious that you yourself could be outlawed in turn. The life of the skogar mader was one of utter misery and paranoia. He was forced to flee to the most desolate and remote parts of the land, the deep forests, the high mountains, the barren wastes. He lived in caves or crude shelters, surviving by poaching and stealing, always looking over his shoulder, seeing an enemy in every shadow. The sagas paint a grim picture of this existence, the crushing loneliness, the gnawing hunger, the constant fear of the bounty hunter, or the vengeful kinsman. He was haunted not only by men, but by the belief that he had been abandoned by the gods as well. It was a life stripped of everything that made a Viking a person family, honor, community, and purpose. It was, in every meaningful way, a death that you were forced to live through, a cold and lonely hell on earth. This was the ultimate expression of Viking justice. If you could not live within the circle of law and honor, you would be cast out into the wilderness to be forgotten by all but the wolves and the wind. The sagas, those epic tales of blood, honor, and fate, have left us with haunting portraits of the men who bore the title of skogar mader. Their stories are not simple tales of good and evil, but complex tragedies that reveal the human cost of this fearsome sentence. Perhaps no figure looms larger in the lore of the outlaw than Grettir Asmundarson, known to history as Grettir the Strong. His is the story of a man whose incredible strength could overcome any monster, but not the slow, grinding weight of the law. Grettir was a difficult man from his youth, stubborn, quick to anger, and possessing a strength that set him apart from all others. He was not malicious, but his temper and immense power often led him into trouble. He was not declared an outlaw for a crime of calculated cruelty or cowardice, which makes his fate all the more tragic. While in Norway, seeking shelter from a storm, he took refuge in a hut with a group of other men. During the night, a fire he had been tending spread, and the hut burned down, killing those inside. Though it was an accident, his enemies back in Iceland seized the opportunity. At the Thing, they argued the case against him, and through political maneuvering, Grettir was sentenced to full outlawry for negligent manslaughter. He was now a man with no home and no rights, and so began one of the longest and most famous outlawries in the sagas. For nearly 20 years, Grettir wandered the wilds of Iceland. His story is a catalogue of incredible feats. He battled trolls in their lairs, fought Draugr the undead walking dead in haunted burial mounds, and defeated other outlaws who sought to test his strength. His physical prowess was legendary, allowing him to survive in conditions that would have destroyed any ordinary man. He lived in remote caves and on lonely, windswept heaths, a solitary giant against a hostile world. But his greatest battle was not against men or monsters. It was against the crushing loneliness and paranoia of his existence. The sagas tell us that after a terrifying battle with the undead Draugr named Glam, Grettir was cursed. Glam's dying eyes filled him with a paralyzing fear of the dark. From that day forward, this man of superhuman strength could not bear to be alone once night fell. He, who could wrestle a bear, would see terrifying illusions in every shadow. This detail is what makes Grettir's story so poignant. It shows that the true horror of being an outlaw was not the constant threat of physical violence, but the slow erosion of the mind. The sentence of Skagengr was a psychological torment as much as a legal one. For 2 decades he endured, a living legend hunted by his fellow men. He grew old in his outlawry, his strength beginning to fade, his spirit worn down by years of isolation. In the end, he was not defeated in a fair fight. He had taken refuge on the remote, cliff-bound island of Drangi, a near impenetrable fortress. But his enemies found him there when he was old, sick, and suffering from a wound that would not heal. They used sorcery to aid their attack, and they killed him not in honorable combat, but as he lay helpless. Grettir the Strong, the man who had defeated every foe, was finally brought down by treachery and time. His story is a powerful illustration of the outlaw's fate, a life of struggle against the world, only to meet an end devoid of the honor he had lost so long ago. If Grettir's tale is one of tragic endurance, the story of Gisli Sursson is a tragedy of a different kind, that of a good man trapped in an impossible web of conflicting loyalties. Gisli's saga is not about a troublemaker, but about an honorable man whose world is torn apart by the rigid demands of the blood feud and the sacredness of the oath. Gisli's doom was set in motion by a vow. He and his brother-in-law, Vestine, become sworn blood brothers, a sacred bond that legally made them as close as kin. But another of Gisli's brothers-in-law, Thorgrim, grows jealous and conspires to have Vestine murdered. When Vestine is killed, Gisli is faced with an unbearable choice. The man murdered was his sworn blood brother, and honor demanded vengeance. But the man who orchestrated the murder was the brother of his own beloved wife, Audre. To avenge one family tie, he must break another, bound by his sacred oath. Gisli chooses loyalty to his blood brother. Under the cover of darkness, he sneaks into Thorgrim's house and kills him with a spear, fulfilling his duty of vengeance. He has acted honorably according to one code, but he has also committed a killing that will inevitably lead to his own downfall. Thorgrim's kin demand justice, And at the thing, Gisli is declared a full outlaw. His life as a Skoggarmr begins, and it is a stark contrast to Grettir's. For 13 years, Gisli lives as a fugitive, hunted through the rugged and beautiful Westfjords of Iceland. He is not a brute force of nature like Grettir, but a cunning and resourceful man, constantly on the move, hiding in caves and remote shacks. Throughout his ordeal, he is aided by his fiercely loyal wife, Otter, who repeatedly risks her own life and honor to bring him food, news, and comfort. Her devotion stands as a testament to a love that even the law could not break. What truly sets Gisli's story apart is its deep psychological and supernatural element. As he sleeps, Gisli is visited by two dream women. One is beautiful and benevolent, riding a white horse. She offers him words of comfort, treats his wounds, and foretells that though he must suffer for a time, he will eventually find peace and die an honorable death. The other is a terrifying figure on a gray horse, who tries to wash him in blood and gore, whispering prophecies of doom and damnation. These dreams become his only companions, a nightly battle between hope and despair that mirrors his waking life. In the end, after 13 years of running, Gisli is cornered. Betrayed and surrounded, he does not surrender, nor is he killed in his sleep. He makes a heroic last stand. The saga describes him fighting with ferocious courage, his strength renewed by a final, inspiring dream. He holds off his attackers, killing many of them before he is finally overcome. With his guts spilling from a mortal wound, he is said to have tightened his belt around his waist, and with his last breath, cast a stone at his enemies. He dies on his feet, a true warrior's death, fulfilling the promise of his good dream woman. Gisli's story shows that even for an outlaw, that most dishonored of men, a small measure of dumb or a good name could be won back in the end, not through law, but through courage. The legal world of the Vikings, with its intricate system of fines and its profound sentence of outlawry, can seem almost intellectual in its approach to justice. It was a system that valued social balance and honor above all else. However, we should not be mistaken. This was not a world without raw, physical brutality. While compensation was the preferred path for settling disputes among free men, there were times when justice was delivered not with silver, but with the rope, the stone, and the lash. These moments were perhaps less common, but they were vicious, serving as a stark reminder of the violence that always simmered just beneath the surface of the law. The most frequent recipients of physical punishment were those at the very bottom of the social ladder, the slaves, or thralls. A thrall was not considered a person in the legal sense. They were property, like a cow or a chest of tools. If a slave committed a crime, such as stealing from their master or attempting to run away, their fate was not decided at the thing. It was decided by their owner. The master had the right to punish their thralls as they saw fit, and this often involved flogging, branding, or other cruelties. If a thrall killed another person's slave, the matter was settled by the owners, who would agree on a simple economic compensation for the lost property. And if a master killed their own thrall, it was generally not considered a crime at all. This brutal reality underscores the rigid hierarchy of the Viking world, where the protection of the law was a privilege of freedom. For free men and women, execution was a possible, though less frequent, outcome for the most heinous crimes. Hanging was one of the most common methods, and it was considered a deeply shameful death. To die in battle was glorious. To die by the sword in a duel was honorable, but to die dangling at the end of a rope was the death of a common thief. It carried a dark religious overtone, as Odin was known as the god of the hanged, and sacrifices to him sometimes involved hanging. Thus, to be hanged was to be given a death devoid of dignity, an offering to a grim god. For certain crimes, particularly those associated with women, drowning was the preferred method of execution. Women accused of practicing forbidden magic, or cedar, were often bound and thrown into a bog or a river. This was seen as a less bloody, and therefore perhaps less honorable, death than won by a blade, and it served to quietly dispose of those deemed to be a supernatural threat to the community. Stoning, too, was used on occasion, a form of execution where the entire community could participate, hurling stones at the condemned until they were dead. This act diffused the responsibility for the killing. It was not one man who took a life, but the community as a whole, acting as a single instrument of justice. While mutilation, such as the cutting off of a hand or a foot for a thief, appears in some early Germanic law codes, it seems to have been less common in the Viking Age proper than fines or outlawry. The Norse system generally preferred a punishment that either removed the offender from society or reintegrated them through payment. A permanent physical marking was a visible, lifelong punishment that made reintegration difficult. However, these brutal physical punishments, though rarer than financial ones, served a vital purpose. They were the law's final, unambiguous answer to those who could not or would not abide by the complex system of honor and compensation. They were the raw power that backed up the social contract, a terrifying glimpse of the pain that awaited those who pushed the community too far. There is a name that echoes from the Viking Age, a name that has been whispered in horror for 1,000 years. It is not the name of a king or a warrior, but of a punishment, or perhaps a ritual so savage, so grotesquely theatrical, that it has come to symbolize the very peak of Norse brutality. This is the blood eagle, the blowdorn. It is an image of unimaginable agony that has stained the legacy of the Vikings. But it is also an image shrouded in mystery, a terrible ghost that historians still debate. Was this ghastly ceremony a real practice, or is it merely a dark and brilliant piece of literary fiction, a nightmare born from poetry and fear? Let us first speak of the ritual as the sagas describe it, not to revel in its horror, but to understand the sheer power of the image it created. The victim, always a man of high status and an enemy of great significance, would be captured and laid face down, his arms spread wide. The executioner would then take a sharp blade and, starting from the spine, would cut the ribs away from the backbone, one by one. The ribs would then be bent and pulled outwards, creating a pair of gruesome, bloody wings. In the final and most horrific step, the executioner would reach into the cavity and pull the victim's lungs out from his back, laying them upon the freshly made wings. The sagas suggest that the final, fluttering convulsions of the dying man's lungs would resemble the gentle beating of a great bird's wings. It was a death designed to be the ultimate act of vengeance and a sacrifice to Odin, the god of war and death. The accounts of the blood eagle come to us not from law codes or historical chronicles, but from the fiery verses of skaldic poetry and the epic narratives of the sagas, written down centuries after the events they describe, often by Christian scribes. The sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok are said to have performed it on King Aella of Northumbria to avenge their father's death. In another tale, The powerful Earl Einar of Orkney performs it on the son of the Norwegian king. These stories are vivid, powerful, and deeply disturbing. But were they true? Many historians argue that the blood eagle was likely a literary invention, a misunderstanding of complex poetry, or a piece of anti-pagan propaganda. Christian writers had every reason to portray their Viking ancestors as bloodthirsty savages, to highlight the darkness that had been vanquished by the light of faith. They might have misinterpreted poetic Kenning's Norse metaphorical phrases that described a warrior's back being torn apart by the claws of an eagle on the battlefield. The phrase, to carve an eagle on one's back, could have been a poetic way of saying, to kill a man violently and leave his corpse for the scavengers. Furthermore, the anatomical reality of the ritual is highly questionable. A victim would likely die from shock, blood loss, and the collapse of their lungs long before the full, ghastly spectacle could be completed. The idea of pulling out intact, flapping lungs is a medical impossibility. It seems more like a scene from a dark fantasy than a practical method of execution. And yet, the idea refuses to die completely. Some scholars argue that while the full, drawn-out ritual may be an exaggeration, it could be based on a kernel of truth. The descriptions in the sagas are chillingly specific and appear in several different sources. Perhaps a more basic form of the ritual existed, a symbolic carving of an eagle onto a victim's back as a mark of ultimate humiliation and revenge. It may have been an exceptionally rare act, reserved only for the most hated of enemies, a way to inflict a punishment so terrible that it would be remembered in song and story for generations. In the end, we will likely never know for certain. There is no definitive archaeological evidence, no unbiased contemporary account. The blood eagle remains trapped in the twilight between history and myth. But its power is undeniable. Whether it was a real execution or a poet's dark dream, it tells us something profound about the Viking imagination. It speaks to a culture that understood vengeance not just as an act, but as an art form, and that saw honor and dishonor in terms so absolute that even death itself could be transformed into a terrible and unforgettable symbol. The blood eagle is a haunting reminder that sometimes the stories we tell about justice can be even more powerful than the justice we actually deliver. The image of the Viking is inseparable from the sea. It was their highway, their hunting ground, and their path to fame and fortune. The iconic longship, with its dragon prow cleaving through the cold, gray waves, is a symbol of their power. We often use the word pirate to describe these seafarers, picturing them as lawless men who preyed on the helpless. But, as with so much of the Viking world, the reality was more complex. In their own eyes, there was a vast difference between an honorable warrior engaged in a raid and a common sea thief. The line between them was drawn with the same ink as all Norse law honor. To go a Viking or I Viking was a legitimate and often celebrated activity. It was a seasonal enterprise, a venture that young men undertook to gain wealth, prove their courage, and build their reputation. A chieftain would announce his intention to lead a voyage, gather a crew of volunteers, and set sail for foreign shores. The key was that this was done openly. It was a recognized form of low-level warfare and economic enterprise. They were not attacking their own people or their allies. They were raiding their enemies, the kingdoms of England, Francia, or the lands along the Baltic coast. When a crew returned home, their ships heavy with silver, silk, and slaves, they were not shunned as criminals. They were welcomed as heroes. The plunder was shared. Songs were sung of their deeds, and their fame grew. A successful raid was a testament to a man's strength, cunning, and luck. This was entirely different from what the Norse would have considered criminal piracy. A man who lurked in the coastal waterways to ambush a trading vessel from a neighboring fjord was not a Vikinger. He was a thief. A crew that attacked and slaughtered another Norse ship for its cargo was not engaged in honorable raiding. They were murderers. These acts were seen as shameful and cowardly, no different from the thief who steals a cow in the night or the murderer who strikes from the shadows. Such men were not celebrated. They were criminals who could be brought before the thing and sentenced. Their actions brought shame not only upon themselves, but upon their families. They were sea wolves, preying on their own kind, and they would be hunted as such. Even on a longship, far from the laws of the land, a strict code of conduct often applied. Before a voyage, a crew would often agree to a set of rules known as ship law, or skip a narlog. These rules governed the fair division of plunder, the duties of each man on board, and the settling of disputes that might arise during the long, cramped weeks at sea. A man who stole more than his fair share of the loot or who caused strife among the crew could face punishment, even being marooned or thrown overboard. The longship was a microcosm of their society, a fragile community that relied on trust and a shared code to survive the dangers of the sea. So, the next time you picture a Viking longship, remember this distinction. The men on board were not a chaotic horde of pirates in the modern sense. They were often a disciplined crew, bound by oaths and a shared purpose, operating within a clear cultural framework. In their minds, sailing across the sea to raid a monastery in Northumbria was an act of honorable, if brutal, work. But attacking a fellow Norseman on the same sea was a crime deserving of the harshest punishment. For the Vikings, the law did not stop at the water's edge. It simply changed its shape, guided always by that single, unwavering star honor. The world of Viking law, with its focus on the honor of free men, was largely a patriarchal one. Yet, it is a mistake to assume that women were silent or powerless. In many ways, Norse women enjoyed more rights than their counterparts in other parts of medieval Europe. They could own property, inherit land, run the farmstead while their husbands were away, and even initiate divorce. But within the sphere of criminal law, their lives were governed by a unique and often unforgiving set of standards, particularly concerning matters of fidelity and the mysterious arts. For a woman, the crime of adultery was a catastrophic offense, one that struck at the heart of the family structure. A wife's infidelity was not seen as a private moral failing. It was a deep betrayal of her husband's honor and a direct threat to the purity of his bloodline. In a society where inheritance and kinship were paramount, any doubt about a child's paternity could unravel a family's legacy. The law, therefore, treated the matter with brutal finality. If a husband caught his wife in the act with another man, he had the legal right to kill them both on the spot. This was not considered murder. It was his right as an honorable man to cleanse the stain upon his name. If he chose a less violent path, he could divorce her immediately. This was not a simple separation. The divorced woman would be left in utter shame, often stripped of her property and social standing, forced to return to her own family as a disgraced burden. Her lover, meanwhile, would face the full force of the law, likely being forced to pay a crippling fine to the husband, or, if the offense was deemed serious enough, being sentenced to outlawry. There was, of course, a stark double standard. While a wife's affair was a capital crime, a husband's infidelity, especially with a slave or an unmarried woman of lower status, was often not considered a crime at all. The law was designed primarily to protect the man's lineage and honor. Beyond the realm of domestic life, there was another area where women held a powerful and perilous position: the world of magic. The Norse believed in a form of magic known as cedar, a practice that involved divination, shaping fate, and communing with spirits. It was a powerful and ambiguous art, and it was almost exclusively the domain of women. The practitioners, known as a vulva or seeress, were both feared and respected. A powerful vulva might be invited by a chieftain to his hall to foretell the future of his family or the outcome of a battle. However, the power to see the future was also the power to twist it. Satyr was not considered inherently evil, but it could be used for malicious purposes. A woman who used her knowledge to curse an enemy, to bring sickness to their livestock, or to cause harm through unseen forces was considered a practitioner of black magic. This was a crime that terrified the community. An enemy you can see can be fought with an axe, but an enemy who attacks with whispers and curses was a far more insidious threat. A woman accused of malevolent witchcraft would be brought before the thing, where fear and superstition often weighed as heavily as any evidence. If she was found guilty, the punishment was absolute. She was a danger to the very order of the world, and she had to be destroyed. The execution method was often drowning or stoning. These were seen as ways to dispose of the witch's body without spilling her blood on the land, which was thought to be a way to contain her dangerous spiritual power. In this mysterious realm, women held a unique power that men did not. But with that power came the ultimate risk. To be a woman in the Viking world was to walk a path defined by strict expectations, where a mistake in the marriage bed or a dark rumor in the village could lead to a swift and pitiless end. For all its intricate rules and its deep-seated sense of honor, the Viking legal system had a fatal flaw. It was a magnificent structure built on a fragile foundation: the willingness of all parties to accept the outcome. The thing could pass judgment. The law speaker could recite the code, and a fine could be set, but the system had no king, no police, and no army to enforce its own rulings. It relied entirely on social pressure and the honor of the men involved. And when that honor was overshadowed by pride, grief, or a thirst for vengeance that no amount of silver could quench, the entire system could shatter, plunging a community into the very chaos it was designed to prevent: the blood feud. There is no greater illustration of this breakdown than the epic and tragic Icelandic narrative, Njál's Saga, or the Saga of Burnt Njál. It is a story that begins with friendship and law, and ends in fire and ruin, a cautionary tale about the limits of a justice system in the face of human passion. The saga centers on two great friends, Gunnar of Hlíðarendi, a heroic and peerless warrior, but a man of simple heart, and his closest friend, Njál, a wise and gentle farmer renowned for his unparalleled knowledge of the law and his gift of foresight. They are the pillars of their community, but their friendship is tested and ultimately destroyed by the pride of their wives, Hallgerdr and Bergthora. A petty insult between the two women at a feast sparks a deadly chain reaction. It begins small. Hallgerdr has one of Njál's servants killed. In response, Bergthora has one of Hallgerdr's servants killed. Again and again, Gunnar and Njál desperate to preserve their friendship and the peace, take the matter to the thing. They follow the law perfectly. A killing occurs, a fine is assessed, and the wergild is paid. Balance is, in theory, restored. But the story masterfully shows that while the law can settle a claim, it cannot heal a wound. The underlying resentment festers. The cycle of killing continues, escalating from slaves to free men, each death demanding another in return. Each legal settlement at the thing becomes just a temporary pause in a feud that is spiraling out of control. Eventually, the violence consumes Gunnar himself. After being manipulated into a battle, he is sentenced to lesser outlawry. His friend Njal warns him to leave Iceland for his 3 years of exile, as the law demands. But as Gunnar rides away from his beautiful farmstead, he looks back and is so moved by the beauty of his home that he cannot bear to leave it. He turns back, violating the terms of his sentence and making himself a full outlaw. His enemies, now legally entitled to kill him, besiege his home. Gunnar fights with legendary courage, but is eventually slain. The feud does not end with his death. Years later, Njal's sons, seeking to avenge an insult against their father, kill a man named Höskuldur. This final killing breaks the cycle of compensation. Höskuldur's kinsmen, led by the formidable Flosi, feel that no amount of silver can atone for this death. The law has failed them. They gather a great war party and march to Njal's farm. They do not challenge the inhabitants to a fight. They surround the longhouse and set it ablaze. Njal, knowing his end has come through his foresight, calmly lies down with his wife and grandson and allows the fire to consume them. They die, not by the sword, but by the failure of the very system Njal had spent his life upholding. The burning of Njal represents the ultimate collapse of the legal order. It is an act of vengeance so extreme that it rips society in two. The final part of the saga details the massive battle that takes place at the next Althing, where the two factions, those of Njal's Avengers and Flosi's party, abandon legal proceedings entirely and fight a pitched battle amongst the booths and judgment rings. The place of law becomes a place of war. Njal's saga is a profound meditation on justice. It shows that a system, no matter how sophisticated, is only as strong as the people within it. And when pride is valued more than peace, and revenge more than reconciliation, even the wisest laws can be turned to ash. The Viking longhouse was the center of the Norse world. It was a home, a workplace, a fortress, and a sanctuary. Within its timber walls, under the smoky haze from the central hearth, generations were born, families were raised, and the quiet dramas of daily life unfolded. And just as there was a law for the fields and the fjords, there was a law for the home. It was a set of rules governing the most personal of relationships, those between husband and wife, and it reveals a world far more complex than the simple patriarchal stereotype might suggest. Marriage, for the Vikings, was a serious contract, more of a strategic alliance between families than a union of romantic love. It was a means of securing property, building powerful connections, and ensuring the continuation of a bloodline. A woman's father or male guardian arranged the match, and her consent was not always a primary concern. The transaction was formalized with the exchange of a bride price from the groom's family and a dowry from the bride's. This dowry was not a gift to the husband. Legally, it remained the wife's personal property throughout the marriage. This economic independence gave Norse women a degree of autonomy and power that was rare in the medieval world. She was not her husband's property. She was his partner in managing the household, the keeper of the keys to the larder and the chests of wealth. But what happened when this partnership soured? What happened when the home became a place not of sanctuary, but of conflict? The law provided an answer: divorce. Unlike in many other European cultures of the time, divorce in the Viking Age was a relatively straightforward process, and one that could be initiated by either the husband or the wife. A person wishing to end their marriage simply had to declare their intention to do so in front of a group of formal witnesses, first at their own hearth, then at the threshold of their home, and finally at the local thing. The grounds for divorce were varied. A man could divorce his wife if she was unfaithful, if she brought shame upon his name, or if she was unable to bear children. A woman, however, also had clear legal grounds to leave her husband. If he impoverished the family through laziness or incompetence, she could divorce him. If he struck her, she had the right to leave. The law codes are remarkably specific on this point. A man who struck his wife 3 times without just cause could be divorced. She could also leave him if he publicly shamed her, or even if he chose to wear clothing considered shamefully effeminate, as this brought dishonor upon the household. Upon divorce, the division of property was handled according to clear rules. The wife took back her dowry and any personal gifts she had received. The shared property accumulated during the marriage was often divided, and arrangements were made for the care of any children. A divorced woman was not cast out as a pariah. She could return to her own family, her property intact, and was free to remarry. This legal framework provided women with a crucial escape hatch from an unhappy or abusive marriage. This is not to say that the home was a place of gender equality. It was still a man's world. But the law recognized that a household could only function if both partners were treated with a degree of respect. A man who abused his wife was not seen as strong. He was seen as a poor manager of his own home, a man who could not maintain domestic peace. The story of Hallgerdr from Njaal's saga is a perfect example. Before her ill-fated marriage to Gunnar, she is married to a brutal man who strikes her. In response, her hot-tempered foster father seeks him out and kills him, an act of vengeance that, while extreme, highlights the belief that violence against a kinswoman was an insult that had to be answered. The law of the Longhouse was a delicate balance of power, property, and pride, a system that, for all its patriarchal leanings, understood that the strength of a family depended on more than just the strength of its men. In a world that operated largely without written contracts, where a man's survival depended on the promises of his kin and his chieftain, there was one pillar that held the entire social structure aloft: the spoken oath. A vow, in the Viking Age, was not a casual promise. It was a sacred, binding contract, a piece of a person's soul given freely as collateral. To break an oath was therefore not just a lie or a betrayal. It was a sacrilegious act, an unforgivable sin that invited the wrath of both gods and men. It was a crime so foul that it often placed the offender beyond any hope of compensation or redemption. The swearing of an oath was a solemn ritual. It was not done lightly. A man might place his hand upon his sword, a symbol of his martial honor. Or, for the most serious of vows, he might swear upon a sacred arm ring, a bogger, which had been consecrated on the altar of a temple. As he spoke his promise, He would call upon the gods to act as his witnesses and, more importantly, as the enforcers of his vow. He might invoke Thor, the guardian of oaths, or Odin, the Allfather, asking them to bless him if he kept his word, and to curse and destroy him if he dared to break it. This act turned a simple promise into a cosmic bargain. It was no longer a matter between two people. It was a matter between a man and his gods. Oaths were the invisible threads that wove Viking society together. At the Thing, witnesses and their supporters swore oaths to attest to a person's character, and the entire legal process rested on the belief that they were telling the truth. Warriors swore oaths of fealty to their chieftains, promising to fight and die for them in exchange for protection and a share of the spoils. Men entered into sacred bonds of fosterage or blood brotherhood, the Fosbraidrelag, a ritual where they would mingle their blood and swear to treat each other as kin, avenging one another as they would a real brother. These vows created families not of blood, but of choice, and were considered just as, if not more, binding. To break such a vow was to commit a crime against the very fabric of reality. It was to prove that your word was worthless, your honor a fiction. A man who broke his oath was known as a gridnadingur, a truce breaker, a person who could never be trusted again. He had not only betrayed his fellow man, he had personally insulted the gods he had called upon to witness his promise. This was a crime that silver could not fix. No amount of Wergild could restore the trust that had been shattered. Consequently, the punishment for proven oath-breaking was one of the most severe the law could deliver: full outlawry. There was rarely any other consideration. An oath-breaker was immediately cast out, declared a skogar madur, a non-person to be hunted and killed. By proving himself to be a man without honor, he had forfeited his right to live in a society of honorable men. His act was seen as a kind of spiritual poison, and the only way to protect the community was to expel him completely. In a world held together by spoken promises, the man who broke his word had committed a form of treason against society itself, and for that, there was no forgiveness. The relationship between the Vikings and their gods was not one of quiet, submissive worship. It was a practical, and often transactional, affair. The Norse gods, Odin, Thor of Freyr, Freya, were not distant, perfect beings. They were powerful, flawed, and active participants in the affairs of the world. They could be appeased with sacrifice, angered by disrespect, and their favor was essential for a good harvest, victory in battle, or a safe sea voyage. Therefore, a crime against the gods was not merely a matter of personal faith. It was an act of reckless endangerment that could bring ruin upon the entire community. The law recognized certain places and objects as sacred. Places where the veil between the world of humans and the world of the divine was thin. This could be a temple, known as a hof, where idols of the gods were kept and rituals were performed. It could be a sacred grove of trees, a quiet, ancient place left untouched by the axe. Or it could be a burial mound, a hogger, the eternal home of a great chieftain, whose ancestral spirit was believed to watch over the land. To defile such a place was a crime of the highest order. Sacrilege could take many forms. To steal a silver arm ring from a temple altar was far worse than stealing one from a man's arm. The first was simple theft. The second was an insult to the god himself. To break into a burial mound, to plunder the grave goods buried with the dead, was not just robbery, it was a desecration of the ancestors, an act that could stir the undead to walk the earth in vengeance. And to openly mock or damage an idol of a powerful god like Thor was to invite his fury not just upon yourself, but upon your entire village. It was like daring the thunderstorm to strike your home. Blasphemy, too, was a serious offense, though perhaps not in the way we think of it today. The Norse were not overly concerned with doctrinal purity or a strict creed. The crime was not disbelief, but profound disrespect. To publicly scorn the gods, to attribute a community's misfortune to their weakness or malice, or to boast that you were more powerful than they were, these were words that could sever the fragile peace between humans and the divine. The community would see such a person as a lightning rod for disaster, a fool who was risking famine, plague, or defeat for everyone. Because these crimes threatened the well-being of the entire community, the punishment was swift, brutal, and designed to publicly distance everyone from the offender. A person convicted of sacrilege or blasphemy could not be allowed to remain. There was no fine that could appease an angered god. The sentence was almost invariably death or full outlawry. In some cases, the punishment took on a grim, ritualistic quality. The offender might be offered as a human sacrifice to the very god they had insulted, their death serving as a desperate apology from the community. They were no longer just a criminal being executed, they were a forced offering, a life given to restore the cosmic balance they had so foolishly upset. In a world where survival depended on the fickle moods of the gods, the law had no tolerance for those who dared to provoke them. We have spoken of Neath, the poison of slander, and how it could shatter a Viking's honor. But to truly grasp its power, we must understand that this was not merely a crime of gossip or angry words. It was an art form. In the Viking Age, the most skilled poets, the skalds, were as feared and respected as the most skilled warriors. A chieftain's power was measured not only by the number of swords at his command, but by the sharpness of his poet's tongue. A skald could weave praise poetry that would make a man's name immortal, ensuring his glory would be sung for generations. Or he could compose a verse of mockery, a nidvisur, so cutting and so clever that it could dismantle a man's reputation, leaving him socially ruined. Words were magic. They could build a man up, or they could unmake him entirely. And no figure from the sagas embodies this terrifying power of the spoken word more than Egil Skallagrimsson, one of the most complex and brilliant figures of his time. Egil was a fierce and often brutal warrior, but he was also a poet of sublime genius. His story is a testament to how poetry could function as both a shield and a sword. In his conflict with King Eric Bloodaxe and his formidable wife, Queen Gunhild of Norway, Egil demonstrates the ultimate act of ritual slander. After being driven from Norway and wronged by the royal couple, Egil does not merely sail away, nursing a grudge. He performs a formal and terrifying curse. He goes ashore, takes a tall hazel pole, and carves runes of power into its length. He then takes a horse's head, fresh from the kill, and impales it upon the top of the pole, its dead eyes and bared teeth facing inland toward his enemies. This was the Nidstong, the spite pole. As he planted it in the ground, he spoke a formal curse, calling upon the spirits of the land Vaetir, to rise up and drive the king and queen from their own kingdom until they had made amends with him. This was not a simple insult. It was a declaration of spiritual war, a weaponized poem made of wood, bone, and magic. And according to the saga, it worked. The land grew restless, and Eric and Gunhild's reign soon faltered. Yet, poetry could also be a tool of salvation. In another famous episode, Egil is shipwrecked on the coast of Northumbria, which is now ruled by his sworn enemy, King Eric. He is captured and immediately sentenced to death. Knowing he will be beheaded in the morning, Egil does not beg for his life. Instead, he spends the entire night composing a poem. It is a magnificent 20-stanza praise poem for his enemy, a work of such technical brilliance and flattering power that it is known forever after as the Hofudlausen, or head ransom. The next morning, as he is led to his execution, Egil asks for permission to recite his composition. The king, perhaps out of curiosity, agrees. Egil delivers the poem, his powerful voice filling the hall with intricate verses praising Eric's generosity and martial prowess. When he is finished, the hall is silent. The king is so impressed by the sheer artistry of the poem, and by the audacity of the man who created it while facing certain death, that he does the unthinkable. He grants Egil his life. His head is literally ransomed by the power of his own words. Egil's story reveals the profound respect the Vikings had for language. A well-crafted phrase was a thing of immense power, capable of cursing a king or saving a life. It is no wonder, then, that the law treated the misuse of such power, the crime of slander, with such deadly seriousness. We have spent our time in the world of the free, in the realm of honor, oaths, and the intricate dance of the law at the thing. But beneath this structure, supporting its weight in silent, unceasing labor, lived another class of people for whom this justice system was a distant, irrelevant fiction. These were the thralls, the enslaved men and women who formed the backbone of the Viking economy. For this large portion of the population, there was no law, no honor to defend, and no court to appeal to. There was only the will of their master. Who were these thralls? Many were the spoils of war, captives taken during raids on the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and the Slavic lands. They were men, women, and children torn from their homes and shipped across the sea to a life of servitude. Others were born into it, the children of enslaved parents, destined to inherit their status. And some were Norsemen themselves, those who had fallen into such deep debt that they were forced to sell themselves or their children into bondage to survive. Whatever their origin, their legal status was the same. They were property. A thrall was no different in the eyes of the law from a cow, a plow, or a cooking pot. Because they were considered chattel, thralls had no access to the legal world. They could not bring a case to the thing. They could not swear an oath. They had no wergild, no man price, because they were not considered full persons. Their lives were lived entirely outside the circle of law and honor that so defined the existence of the free. This legal non-existence had brutal and absolute consequences. If a thrall committed a crime against their master, stealing food, refusing to work, attempting to escape, the matter was handled not by the law, but by the master's hand. The owner had the legal right to punish their thrall in any way they saw fit, through flogging, branding, or even killing them, with complete impunity. It was no different from a man breaking his own axe out of frustration. If a thrall committed a crime against another free person, it was the master who was held responsible, for it was his property that had caused the harm. He would have to pay a fine, and would then likely inflict his own private punishment on the offending slave. And if a thrall was harmed or killed by a free man, the crime was not against the slave, but against their owner. The offender would have to pay the master the thrall's economic value compensation for lost labor, but there was no further penalty for taking the life. Was there any escape? For some, yes. A master could choose to free a thrall, a process known as manumission. This could be a reward for long and loyal service, or it could be done on a master's deathbed. In some cases, a thrall who was allowed to work for themselves in their spare time might even be able to save enough to buy their own freedom. Upon being freed, they became a Leysinger, a freedman. They were no longer property. They could own land, marry freely, and had legal rights. But they were not fully equal. A freedman's status was always lower than that of a freeborn farmer, and their wergild was significantly less. They occupied a liminal space between slavery and true freedom, a reminder that the stain of servitude was not easily washed away. Imagine a thrall captured as a boy from a village in Ireland, now grown old in the service of a Norse farmer. He has known nothing but work, obedience, and the fear of his master's temper. One day, accused of a minor theft, he is not summoned to the thing. There are no oath helpers to speak for him. There is only the cold fury in his master's eyes, the rough hands that drag him to a post in the middle of the farmyard, and the bite of the lash on his back. The law is silent, for in this matter, it does not exist. This was the grim reality for thousands who lived and died in the Viking world, a silent foundation upon which the great halls of honor and law were built. In our modern world, the law is a physical thing. It exists in vast, leather-bound books, in sprawling digital databases, and on endless scrolls of official documents. It is static, silent, and can be referenced at will. But in the Viking Age, long before widespread literacy took hold in Scandinavia, the law was a living, breathing entity. It did not reside on a page, it resided in the mind of one extraordinary individual, the law speaker, or Lagsogumador. This figure, standing at the heart of the thing, was not a judge, a king, or a prosecutor. He was something far more profound. He was the voice of the law itself, a human library whose memory was the ultimate legal authority in the land. Laws. The position of law speaker was one of immense prestige and staggering responsibility. In Iceland, where a unified legal code was essential for the survival of the Commonwealth, the law speaker was the highest office in the land. He was elected by the chieftains at the Althing and served a term of 3 years. During his tenure, his primary and most sacred duty was to recite the entire body of the law from memory. This was done from a special place at the thing known as the Lagberg, or Law Rock. Over the course of his 3-year term, he would recite the whole code, covering 1/3 of it at each annual summer assembly. This public recitation was a vital ritual. It ensured that the law was not a secret known only to the elite, but was accessible to every free man who attended. It was a reaffirmation of their social contract, a reminder of the rules they had all agreed to live by. The sheer feat of memory required for this task is difficult for us to comprehend. The Icelandic law code, later written down as the Gragas Grey Goose Laws, was a vast and complex collection of rules covering everything from inheritance and marriage contracts to land boundaries, shipping regulations, and the precise fines for every conceivable injury. The law speaker had to know it all, word for word. A single mistake could have dramatic consequences, altering the outcome of a case or setting a dangerous precedent. This is why a potential law speaker was chosen not for his wealth or his martial prowess, but for his wisdom, his perceived fairness, And, above all, his phenomenal memory. Beyond his role as a reciter, the law speaker was also the ultimate consultant. When a difficult case arose at the thing, where the legal procedure was unclear, or the two parties disagreed on the interpretation of a law, all eyes would turn to him. He would be asked to speak the law on the matter. His pronouncement was not a judgment of guilt or innocence, but a clarification of procedure. He would state, according to the law, the correct procedure in a case of this nature is, yea, or the law states that the fine for this offense is, twy. His ruling on the process was considered binding. To defy the law speaker's interpretation was to defy the law itself. The sagas are filled with moments where the wisdom of the law speaker is all that stands between order and chaos. In Njál's saga, the wise Njál, while never a law speaker himself, plays a similar role as a legal advisor. His counsel sought by all. The historical figure Snorri Sturluson, the great poet and chieftain who wrote down many of the sagas, also served as law speaker in Iceland in the early 13th century. It was his deep, intimate knowledge of the old laws and oral traditions that allowed him to preserve them for eternity in writing. The law speaker represents a core Viking belief that law was not an abstract concept imposed from above, but a shared tradition, a collective memory that held the community together. He was the guardian of that memory. In a world of fleeting spoken words, his mind was the one fixed point, the unwritten constitution of his people. He was the living embodiment of a society governed not by the sword of a king, but by the remembered wisdom of their ancestors. In a landscape as vast and sparsely populated as Scandinavia, travel was a perilous undertaking. A journey between farmsteads could take days, crossing treacherous mountains, dense forests, and storm-tossed fjords. There were no inns or public houses dotting the roadsides. A traveler's survival often depended entirely on the reception they received at the scattered longhouses they encountered along the way. Out of this stark necessity grew one of the most sacred and deeply held codes of the Viking Age, the laws of hospitality. To offer a traveler food, warmth, and shelter was not merely a matter of kindness. It was a profound social and moral duty. To refuse it, or to harm a guest under one's roof, was a crime that brought deep shame and dishonor. The ancient Norse poem, the Havamal Sayings of the High One, believed to be the words of Odin himself, is filled with practical advice for living, and it speaks directly to this sacred duty. It counsels, "Fire is needed by the one who has just come in. His knees are numb. Food and clothing are needed by the man who has traveled over the mountains." This was not just poetic sentiment. It was the foundation of a social contract. A traveler, upon arriving at a farmstead, had the right to expect hospitality for a short period, typically up to 3 nights. During this time, they were to be treated as a member of the household. They were given a place by the fire, a share of the family's meal, and a safe place to sleep. In return, the guest also had responsibilities. They were expected to be respectful, to share news from the outside world, perhaps to entertain with stories or songs, and crucially, to cause no trouble. They were to place their weapons aside, a symbolic act of trust and peace. For the duration of their stay, the guest was under the host's protection, or grid. To harm a guest was considered a vile act of treachery, a violation of the sanctity of one's own home. Likewise, for a guest to harm their host was an equally despicable crime. The home was a sanctuary, a peacestead, Gridastadr, and this peace extended to all who were lawfully within it. The protection offered to a guest was absolute, even if the traveler was a known enemy. Once they had been accepted over the threshold and had shared a meal, the laws of hospitality were in effect. A host was expected to defend his guest as he would his own kin, even if it put him in conflict with his neighbors. This created powerful moral dilemmas, and the sagas are rich with stories of men torn between their duty to their guest and other loyalties. But this right to hospitality was not limitless. The three-night rule was a practical measure. It gave a traveler enough time to rest and recover before continuing their journey. A guest who overstayed their welcome, who lingered for many days without a good reason, began to be seen not as a traveler, but as a vagrant and a burden. Their status would shift, and the host's obligation would wane. The Havamal also warns hosts to be wary. Do not be so hospitable that you give away your own food, for a host can make a fool of himself. It was a system built on a delicate balance of trust, obligation, and common sense. The laws of hospitality were the glue that made travel, trade, and social interaction possible in a fragmented world. They were an unwritten insurance policy against the dangers of the road. A farmer who offered shelter to a stranger one night knew that one day he or his son might be the one knocking on a strange door, his knees numb with cold, praying for the sight of an open door and a warm fire. To deny another this basic human decency was to risk having it denied to you, breaking the chain of trust that bound their society together. It was a law written not in a book, but in the shared vulnerability of all who traveled under the cold northern sky. The entire edifice of Viking law, with its fines, its duels, and its assemblies, was built for a single purpose: to prevent the eruption of the blood feud. The feud, or daler, was the great terror of Norse society. It was a state of private warfare between two families, a cycle of retaliatory killing that, once begun, could consume generations in a relentless spiral of violence. It was the law's ultimate failure, the terrifying abyss that yawned whenever a settlement could not be reached. The blood feud was not chaotic, mindless violence. It operated on its own grim logic, a dark mirror of the formal legal system, governed by one unyielding principle: a life for a life. A feud could begin in many ways: a killing at a feast, a dispute over land that turns violent, or an insult that cuts too deep. But its most common catalyst was the failure of the weregild system. Imagine a man is killed in a brawl. The killer, following the law, announces the deed and offers to pay the man price to the victim's family. But the victim's family, consumed by grief and rage, refuses the payment. Perhaps they feel the offer is too small, or perhaps they believe that no amount of silver can atone for their loss. Our kinsman is not for sale, they might declare. In that moment of refusal, the formal law ceases to function. The duty to seek justice now falls squarely on the shoulders of the victim's kin. It becomes a matter of honor, a sacred obligation, to avenge the death themselves. The duty of vengeance was not a choice. It was a heavy burden passed from father to son, from brother to brother. The closest male relative of the deceased was expected to take the lead. To fail to avenge a kinsman was to live in a state of perpetual shame. You would be seen as a coward, a man who valued his own safety over the honor of his family. Your neighbors would whisper behind your back. Skalds might compose mocking verses about your inaction. This immense social pressure was the engine that drove the feud forward, often forcing reluctant men into acts of violence they would rather avoid. The feud was not a constant state of open battle. It was a slow burning fire, punctuated by sudden, brutal acts of violence. The two families might live in a state of tense peace for months or even years, each side wary, watching, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. An act of vengeance was rarely a frontal assault. It was often an ambush, a carefully planned attack on an isolated individual or a small group. The goal was to kill a man from the opposing family who was of roughly equal social standing to the original victim. Killing a thrall would not avenge a free farmer. Killing a common man would not avenge a chieftain. The scales of this dark justice had to be balanced. Once the act of revenge was carried out, the killer was expected to follow the same protocol as any other. They would announce the killing openly. Now we are even, the act would declare. But of course, they were rarely even. The family of the newly slain man was now dishonored, and the duty of vengeance now shifted to them. And so, the cycle would continue, each killing begetting the next. A single death could easily spiral into a dozen, decimating both families, destroying their farmsteads, and poisoning the peace of an entire district. It was a social cancer that, once it metastasized, was nearly impossible to remove. The only endpoints were the complete annihilation of one family, the exhaustion of both, or, if cooler heads could eventually prevail, a final settlement brokered by powerful neighbors, where a complex web of fines and arranged marriages would finally tie the warring families together and force a lasting peace. The ever-present threat of this destructive cycle is what gave the formal law its power, for everyone knew the price of its failure was a war fought not on a distant battlefield, but in their own homes and fields. In the sagas of blood and steel, the swords are wielded by men, the axes are swung by men, and the legal arguments at the thing are made by men. It is tempting, then, to see the world of Viking conflict as an exclusively male domain. But to do so would be to miss the subtle, powerful, and often terrifying role that women played in this deadly theater. A woman could not typically take up arms and join the fight, but she held a different kind of weapon, one that could be just as lethal her tongue. In the longhouse, by the warmth of the hearth, women often acted as the wetters of the feud, the catalysts who goaded their male kin into action through shame, memory, and relentless emotional pressure. The term for this role is vot, which means incitement or goading. It was the woman's solemn duty to remember the wrongs done to her family. While men might be tempted to accept a fine or let a grudge fade over time for the sake of peace and commerce, the women of the household were often the keepers of the flame of vengeance. They were the living memory of the family's honor, and they would not allow a slight to be forgotten or a death to go unavenged. Their arena was not the battlefield, but the domestic space, and their methods were profoundly psychological. Imagine a scene from a saga. A kinsman has been slain, and months have passed. The men of the family have made no move, perhaps waiting for a better opportunity, or perhaps secretly hoping the matter will be settled with silver. One evening, as the family eats, the matriarch of the household, the slain man's mother or sister, will perform an act of powerful theater. She might serve the men their meal, but instead of meat, she places a stone on her son's or brother's plate, a silent accusation of his soft, unfeeling heart. Or, more dramatically, she might bring out the bloody shirt of the murdered kinsman, the very one he was wearing when he fell, and drape it over the shoulders of the man whose duty it is to seek revenge. She would not need to say much. The sight, the smell, and the sheer weight of the blood-soaked cloth was an incitement more powerful than any battle cry. "This shirt belonged to your father," she might say quietly. "It will not be washed until it is avenged." This goading often took the form of sharp, shaming words. The sagas are filled with women who use insults of cowardice and unmanliness to stir their male relatives to action. They would compare their own men unfavorably to the heroes of old, or even to their enemies, questioning their courage and their worth. To be called a coward by your wife, mother, or sister in front of your own household was a wound that cut deeper than any blade. It was a direct attack on a man's honor in the one place he was supposed to be master. Many a man in the sagas was driven to undertake a risky act of vengeance, not out of a personal desire for blood, but simply to silence the relentless, shaming voice of a female relative. Hallgerdr from Njal's saga is a prime example of this archetype. Her pride and her sharp tongue are the sparks that ignite the feud between her household and Njal's. But a more potent example comes from the Laxdæla saga, in the figure of Gudrun Osvifursdottir. After her beloved Kjartan is killed by her husband Gudmunder's family, she is consumed by the need for revenge. For years, she pushes her own sons, born from a later marriage, to avenge a man who is not even their direct kin. She constantly reminds them of the glory of Kjartan and the shame of his unavenged death. She tells them they will be nothing but stay-at-home nobodies if they fail in this duty, effectively forcing them into a battle that will lead to their own deaths. Gudrun embodies the Wedder's tragic power, her obsession with past wrongs, and her relentless goading preserve her own sense of honor, but at the cost of her children's lives. These women were not passive victims in the feuds of men. They were active, powerful agents, the strategists and emotional architects of vengeance, ensuring that in a world built on honor, no debt of blood would ever be forgotten. For centuries, the legal and moral landscape of the North had been shaped by the old gods, by the concepts of honor and reputation, and by the grim calculus of the blood feud. It was a system that, for all its harshness, was internally consistent and deeply understood by the people who lived within it. But beginning in the 10th and 11th centuries, a new force began to sweep across Scandinavia, a force that would challenge the very foundations of this ancient world. This was the arrival of Christianity. The conversion to the religion of the White Christ was not just a change of faith. It was a legal and cultural revolution that would slowly dismantle the world we have been exploring. The Christian missionaries and the kings who adopted the new faith brought with them a radically different set of values. Where the old code prized honor and the swift avenging of insults, the new faith preached humility, forgiveness, and the radical idea of turning the other cheek. This was completely alien to the Viking mindset. Forgiving a man who had killed your father was not an act of grace. It was an act of profound cowardice and a betrayal of your family. The Christian concept of sin was also different. For the pagans, a sin was an act that disrupted the social order or angered the gods, like breaking an oath or showing cowardice. For the Christians, sin was a personal, moral failing, a stain on one's own soul, to be settled not with a payment of silver to a wronged family, but through penance and confession to God. This new morality began to slowly erode the pillars of the old legal system. The blood feud, the engine of Norse justice, was anathema to the church. It represented the very cycle of violence that Christian teaching sought to end. Kings who had converted to Christianity, like Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, saw the suppression of the feud as a key goal. It was a way to pacify their kingdoms, to break the power of the old chieftains, and to centralize power in their own hands. They began to promote a new concept, the king's peace. The idea that a crime was not just an offense against an individual, but an offense against the king and his realm, was a revolutionary one. Justice was no longer to be a private matter between families. It was to be a public matter administered by the crown. The church also brought new legal technologies with it. While the old system relied on oaths and duels, the Christian legal tradition introduced trial by ordeal. An accused person might be forced to carry a bar of red-hot iron for a set distance, or to retrieve a stone from a cauldron of boiling water. Their hand would be bandaged and sealed. After 3 days, the bandage would be removed in the presence of a priest. If the wound was healing cleanly, it was a sign from God that they were innocent. If it was festering and infected, it was a sign of their guilt. While this seems utterly irrational to us, it served a key purpose. It took the verdict out of the hands of men and placed it in the hands of God, bypassing the old honor-based procedures. This transition was not quick or easy. For a long time, the two systems existed side by side, creating a confusing and often contradictory legal landscape. People might attend the thing, as their ancestors had, but the proceedings would now be influenced by priests and bishops. The old laws were slowly rewritten, their pagan elements stripped out and replaced with Christian principles. The Wergild system was gradually replaced by a system of royal fines and corporal punishment. The holmgang was outlawed as a barbaric relic. The Icelanders, in a famously pragmatic decision at the Althing in the year 1000, voted to adopt Christianity as their official religion purely as a political measure to prevent a civil war and maintain peace with the Christian kingdoms of Europe, while still allowing the private worship of the old gods. The arrival of the new law was the death knell for the world of Viking justice. It signaled the end of an era where law was a shared memory and vengeance a sacred duty, and the beginning of a new age where law would be written down, centralized, and enforced by the twin powers of the king and the church. As we sit here in the quiet of the modern world, surrounded by a justice system of police, courtrooms, and prisons, the Viking approach can seem alien, almost savage. It was a world of blood money, honor killings, and exile. And yet, if we listen closely, past the clash of steel and the cries of the condemned, we can hear a fascinating and profound question being asked: what is the true purpose of justice? Is it to punish a wrongdoer, or is it to restore what has been broken? For the Norsemen, the answer was overwhelmingly the latter. Their legal system was not primarily built on the idea of retribution. It was built on restoration. When a crime was committed, it created an imbalance, a debt. A man's property was taken, his body was harmed, or his honor was wounded. The goal of the law, therefore, was to reestablish that balance. The intricate system of fines, paid in silver or goods, was a direct effort to make the victim whole again, to compensate them for their loss. Even the Wergild, the man price paid for a life, was not a punishment for the killer in the way we might think of it. It was a payment to the victim's family to prevent a blood feud, a way to formally close a chapter of grief and allow the community to move forward. This stands in stark contrast to many modern legal systems, where justice is often a transaction between the criminal and an abstract entity called the state. In the Viking world, justice was a deeply personal affair between the families involved. The law provided the framework, but the resolution was theirs to enact. This focus on restitution over punishment reveals a worldview where social harmony was the ultimate prize. A man locked away in a non-existent prison was of no use to anyone. A man who paid his debt, however, had mended the tear he had made, allowing life and the community to continue. In this world, without a central government to enforce its laws, what truly kept the peace? It was not the fear of a king's wrath. It was the fear of your neighbor's judgment. The community was the true high court, the ever-present witness, and the ultimate enforcer of the social code. A person's actions were never performed in a vacuum. They were seen, judged, and remembered by everyone around them. This is why honor and reputation were not matters of personal pride, but of public survival. Your dömer, the verdict of your character held by your peers, determined your place in the world. It was a shield more valuable than any piece of steel. A man with a good name could find oath helpers for the thing, a strong marriage for his daughter, and allies in a time of strife. A man with a tarnished name was vulnerable, isolated, and weak. The constant, silent pressure of this collective judgment was the force that kept most people in line. The fear of shame, of being the subject of a mocking poem or public scorn, was a more effective deterrent than any law written on parchment. This creates a society that is, from our perspective, both beautifully connected and potentially suffocating. Your triumphs were your family's triumphs, but your shame was their shame as well. Every action was weighed against its impact on the whole. The ultimate punishment, therefore, was not a swift death, but the deliberate and formal severing of this connection. To be declared an outlaw was to have the community officially state, "You are no longer one of us." It was the legal and social confirmation of a person's complete and utter failure to live in balance with their world. To truly understand the Viking mind, we must understand their conception of hell. It was not a fiery pit in the underworld. It was the cold, silent, and lonely life of the Skogarmadr. The stories of Grettir and Gisli are more than just adventure tales. They are profound psychological dramas about the horror of social death. They reveal that the greatest fear of a Viking was not a clean death in battle, but a slow, meaningless existence in isolation. Think of Grettir, the strongest of men, who could defeat any physical foe but was tormented by a fear of the dark, unable to bear being alone. His tragedy is that his physical strength could not protect him from the psychological decay of his sentence. He was a giant, but he was a ghost, wandering the fringes of a society that had already pronounced him dead. His story shows that for a Viking, identity was not something held internally. It was something granted and reflected by the community. Without the community, you were nothing. Or consider Gisli, a man of great honor, forced into outlawry by a tragic conflict of loyalties. His story is a testament to the bonds that persisted even after the law had spoken. His wife Audra's loyalty is a powerful counterpoint to his legal condemnation. Yet, he too is consumed by his solitude, his only companions, the figures in his dreams. His heroic last stand is a desperate attempt to reclaim a shred of the honor that the law had stripped from him, to die a warrior's death instead of being hunted like an animal. The figure of the outlaw is the ultimate tragedy in the Norse worldview, because it represents a man who has lost his place in the great tapestry of kinship and is left to wander, unremembered and unmourned. It is easy to dismiss the Viking legal system as primitive and brutal, a relic of a savage age, and by our standards, its methods were certainly harsh. But buried within its unfamiliar structure are the seeds of principles that we now consider essential to modern justice. Their world was not one of despotic kings ruling by decree. It was a world governed by law, a law that was created, upheld, and understood by the people themselves. The thing was, in its own way, a remarkable democratic institution. It was a place where free men had a voice, where they could participate directly in the governance of their own lives. The idea of a trial being judged by a panel of one's peers in their case, local landowners and chieftains, is a clear ancestor of our modern jury system. The emphasis on public proceedings, where justice had to be seen to be done, is another principle that has echoed down through the centuries. Even their reliance on oaths and witnesses, while seeming unreliable to us, speaks to a world where a person's word was their bond, a concept rooted in personal integrity. And the very existence of the law speaker, a figure whose authority came not from force, but from knowledge and memory, shows a deep reverence for the law as a living tradition, something to be preserved and passed down. The parliaments of several modern Scandinavian nations, like Iceland's Althing or Norway's Storting, still bear the name of these ancient assemblies, while we have, thankfully, left behind the blood feud and the trial by combat, that core Viking idea that the law should belong to the people, and that its ultimate purpose is to maintain the peace and balance of the community, is a legacy that is still very much alive. The world of Viking justice, with its fierce honor and its cold reckonings, has faded back into the mists of time. The great assemblies are silent now. Imagine, if you will, a wide, green field in Iceland or Norway, where a thing was once held. The judgment ring of stones is still there, but the stones are covered in soft, green moss, and the ground is no longer trodden by anxious feet. There are no chieftains arguing points of law, no plaintiffs seeking restitution, no outlaws hearing their final doom. There is only the sound of the wind whispering through the tall grass, a quiet sigh that carries no judgment. Picture a deep fjord at midnight, the surface of the water as smooth and black as polished obsidian, reflecting the cold, distant stars. The longhouses on the shore are dark and still, their turf roofs blending into the hillside. The fires within have long since burned down to embers. The ghosts of the men and women we have spoken of are at peace now. Grettir no longer fears the dark. Gisli's dream women have ridden away into the fog. The feuds are over. The fines are paid. The blood is dry. All the passion, the vengeance, and the struggle have resolved into a profound and lasting silence. The law of the North sleeps now, and so can you. And as that ancient world drifts away, you can feel yourself safe in your own, here in the quiet of your room. There is no judgment to be passed, no fine to be paid. Your honor is secure. Let the darkness around you be a comfort, a gentle blanket that asks nothing of you. The law of the night is simple and kind. It demands only that you rest. Let the weight of the day settle, and then let it go. Feel it sink away leaving you lighter. There are no oaths to be sworn here, no challenges to be met. The only duty you have now is to your own peace. So breathe, slowly and deeply. Let each breath be a quiet step away from the world of worries and into the world of slumber. The stories are over. The voices of the past have faded. All that is left is the gentle rhythm of your own breathing and the stillness of the night. You are safe. You are at peace. And you are ready to sleep. The sounds you hear now, perhaps the soft hum of a fan, the distant rumble of a passing car, the creak of a floorboard are the sounds of your own time. They are the sounds of a world held together by different laws, different protections. The fierce world of the Vikings has long since dissolved into the earth, becoming the soil upon which new worlds were built. Their struggles, their search for justice and balance in a harsh land, were just one part of a long human story. A story that has, over many centuries, led to the peace and security you feel tonight. Their time of trial is over. And now, so is your day. Thank you, dear traveler, for walking with me through this world of ice and honor. It has been a pleasure to have your company. May the tales of the past serve as a gentle lullaby, carrying you now into a deep and untroubled sleep. Rest well, and let the quiet of history be your guide into pleasant dreams. Until we meet again on another winding road of history, good night.